Hi, welcome to the first edition of the Conférence Pour le Brésil. Antes de começar, gostaríamos de lembrar ao nosso público que o painel com áudio ao vivo em português está disponível em nosso canal no YouTube. My name is Maria Julia Sinesi, and I am a master's student in Human Rights and Humanitarian Action, and I am part of the partnership team of Conférence Pour le Brésil. On behalf of the organizing team, I would like to thank everyone for being here for our panel on the future of work. This conference is organized by Sciences Po Paris students and alumni, and its central theme is the overcoming of inequalities, 10 years to the Sustainable Development Goal. There will be 13 panels and more than 50 speakers distributed over 7 weeks. In addition to the diligent and voluntary work of our team, we thank our partners, Fundação de Setúbal, Political Observatory of Latin America at Sciences Po, Educa Libras, and Headline, for allowing us to create a free online event with simultaneous translations into English, Portuguese, and Brazilian Sign Language. Before we start today's panel, I take the opportunity to invite everyone to participate in our next meeting on November 7th at 11 a.m. Brazil time, in which we will debate issues concerning the environment with the participation of Marina Silva, Alessandro Molon, Yana Lawrence, with moderations by Ana Pelis. And now, Taís Chartouni will be given the floor to introduce the theme of today's panel and introduce our guests. Thank you. Estamos sem o som, no sound from the original at the moment. We are not receiving the original sound in Portuguese. We are not getting the floor. And the fight for inequality. According to the National Household Sample Survey published by IBGE, by May 2020, the employed population in the country has decreased 7 million compared to the same quarter of last year. The unemployment rate has reached 13.8%, with a negative balance of more than 1 million formal jobs accumulated by 2020. Data also point out that the drop in income levels in the recent period has affected the poorest half of the population much more deeply, those who lost a quarter of their income. The existence of a large informal labor market and precarious service sector represents a problem not only for the living conditions of workers who have no guarantee of income, decent working conditions, but how to promote policies that encourage employment and decent work as defined by the International Labour Organization. How to respond to inequalities generated by the lack of opportunity and income qualities. To discuss this important theme, I am happy to introduce our speakers. The first of them is the former minister, Carlos Lupi. He was a deputy at the Federal House of Representatives from 91 to 94, Minister of Labor and Employment, and he's the national president of the PDT political party. Then we will have the pleasure of listening to the working class perspective with the participation of Antônio Lisboa, Secretary of International Relations for CUT, Central Única dos Trabalhadores, since 2014. He is a professor. He was a member of the board of directors and a teacher union at the Federal District between 89 and 95, and then 2001 and 2009. We will also have the contribution from Joana Mostafa, researcher of the Federal Government's Institute of Applied Economic Research, IPEA. She was the director of the social program Single Registry System of the federal government, among which is Bolsa Família. She is an economist with a BA and MA from the State University of Campinas, where she is currently pursuing a PhD in sociology in the fields of social protection and social security and gender. We are going
to Mr. Stijn Broecke. Thank you for joining us tonight. Stijn is a senior economist at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, where he's in charge of the Future of Work initiative. His current research focuses on working conditions in the platform economy, as well as on the impact of artificial intelligence on the labor market. He was co-editor and co-author of the OECD Employment Outlook 2019, focused on the future of work. And Stijn holds a PhD in economics from the University of London, and he has previously held positions at the African Development Bank, the UK Civil Service, and Mozambique Ministry of Health. Muita honra.
I am very honored to be able to moderate this debate with such brilliant people and those who represent such diverse aspect of this issue. I begin by giving the floor to President to Carlos Lupi by asking him a question. President, you were the Minister of Labor and Employment in a period of notorious policies. How do you see the current Brazilian situation and the challenges we face? How can your experience help us reflect us on the issues? First of all, I'd like to thank you because it's such an honor to be with such renowned and prepared people. Let's just discuss this part regarding Brazil. I believe the main policy that may move a nation is the employment that also allows dignity, and also regarding the distribution of income. Although machines are somehow occupying our work, we cannot stop attempting to create a more fairer distribution of income, policy, and salary and work. I am not very sophisticated in my speech, but I can say that the salary is what makes the economy go round. More people selling, more people working, more people manufacturing, and so on. This is the virtuous cycle. I believe that with certain variation, this is being the main contribution from the term with Lula in his first term and second term, and also in the first term with Dilma, because the political economy was focused on income generation and employment, social policies. There's no use having a zero inflation and you don't have any people working. There's no use having an economy growth, but if you do not have anything sustainable for the workers. The Ministry of Work was created in 1930. It will be 90 years on the 6th of November. It's going to probably reach its centenary. Not even the dictatorship was able to remove the Ministry of Work from any term. It has been changed, has been merged to other offices, but it has always been a ministry that has been active. It has become a secretariat sometime earlier, but there has always been a plan. We have a serious problem in Brazil of the removal of rights in a moment in which in what is agreed is more important than what is done. If the agreement is more important than the law, then there's no use having such law. There's no need for a sophistication if there is no understanding on the other side of the table, which is the worker side. This is the weakest link in the process. And for this reason, the experience we had in the Ministry of Labor before, and I'm talking about 4 years of experience, we could generate thousands of jobs during that term. A real readjustment during the term with Lula as president. There was a law that would increase automatically the basic salary in balance with the Brazilian GDP. This is called the positive indexing. We use the right thing is to index prices and not index salaries, and this is the basis of Brazil, which consists of 60% of people who receive the minimum wages. And this is an important part of the improvement of labor conditions. On the other hand, there were other actions that generated improvement in economy and generating employment. Before the Ministry of Labor, we managed to qualify and train young people with Pro Jovem program involving several secretariats and ministries. And the Ministry of Labor has always been a protagonist in this task. And we help the weakest part of society, that is with the Ministry of Economy, and everything is defending the boss. The basic principle is within the Ministry of Work. So the public policies that involve the Ministry of Labor as part of the government is of utmost importance so that society leaves the absolute poverty and recovers the self-esteem. With the public policies, we also had two important funds directed to workers, which is FAT and what we call FGTS, and these are all for the workers, but they are managed by the government. They are both within the ministry. Okay, if you compare who is in advantage in that relationship, you're going to see that they are the ones who employ. If you see of about 4,000 billion reais have been used, if you consider both of these funds that I've mentioned before. It's important in the program we call Minha Casa, Minha Vida, which is important for the workers, and it is used with important resources that come from that second fund, the FGTS amount. With FAT, you'd have to use the Employment Assistance Program, and this is to help the worker. When it is within another ministry, it is helping the bankers and not the workers. And this is usually work to pay debts and not works. And this is the clarity we need in programs. And what is the project for our country? This problem and conflicting use of the Ministry of Labor, of course, there is the right and the wrong, but I have the right to understand what is fair. In a society in which you have billions and billions of Brazilians who depend on work and salary, they cannot be massacred by a political economy that is not fair. You see the Ministry of Labor becoming extinct, and affluent secretariats, and instead of strengthening unions, they ended up destroying the union part of the labor. And this is just a little bit of what this current government is presenting to every one of us. I am not getting into the merit whether it's efficient or not, but unions cannot be ended with. And the relationship cannot only be fair for those who employ. And in this current condition, we need to deepen professional training because the world is becoming automated. You go out on the field, you need one machine to harvest crops. But now we have to start understanding this modern world and digitalized world. One is in France and the other one is in São Paulo, as you see here. We are all live now and talking about things and in a certain way that I could never imagine 10 years ago. And around 1990, for example, in which I started discussing such things. We need to understand, and I'll say that we need to update the labor relations. It doesn't mean leaving the weakest link even weaker. We need to protect people in a more efficient way, and it means providing protection, and I can say, without the public worker in a function in which is of a codependence. We are talking about the diplomats of international relations, but the public salary has to serve the society much more. And instead of workers, we need service. People need to feel as if they were in service to society. And this is why the conditions has to change and improve. This is why a, 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 a recurrent training mechanism has to be in place. And you cannot just sit in a public function and believe that you are going to be just safe and secure in that position. And the efficiency of public service is being checked during this pandemic. You will probably see that there are 4 to 5 countries that have a health system similar to us. If we had left, if we weren't for SUS in our public system, we'd have much more deaths with the pandemic within this scenario. So this is how important the civil servants are. The state needs to be more efficient. How can we serve more instead of just being an employee for the federation? It has to be more efficient to provide awareness and be efficient. This is how we can guarantee rights. I've been with PDT party for 40 years. When I have been defending this for more than 40 years, and the weakest part needs to be protected. And this is like this everywhere. The most fragile of society are the ones who need our help. This is the focus, and this should be the focus of the Ministry of Labor. The workers, they ensure our nation exists. They need to have updated salaries permanently. These are things that have to be considered, but at the same time, each worker has to contribute with their own work and receiving training to be ready more than ever so that they can carry out their functions every day. Well, with everything we've spoken about today, I see in a future in which we have to face some different realities. We are navigating a world with a lot of fake news and a lot of individualism over the collective, and people are thinking of themselves. People are thinking of themselves and disregarding others, and we need to work in plural. I don't know if I still have some time, but I have to say something here, which is a life conception for me. And I've been in many public functions. We are going to bother a lot of people, but we have to think of ourselves and act as human beings. We need a society in which children are not abandoned, a society in which the old people are respected. Uh, when we are in a moment in which people are not treated as human beings, this is going to be wrong, because life is what is the most important asset. The world of labor needs to be updated, requalify, understand this market. And I am above 6 years old, and you can understand that. And I have to keep training and keep learning. I really would like to wish that we are instruments of a society that is permanently facing walls that have been built due to racism and all sorts of discrimination, all discrimination that puts the human beings in a second place, a place in which we're diminished by the powerful. I apologize if I've said too much. Thank you.
Thank you very much for providing this kind of an input, President Lupi. It's important for the fight for the right and better conditions for Brazilians, and it speaks about having a focus on economical interests and the organization of the system, which is what we use for the reorganization of the labor laws and the pension fund reform and public expenditure. So this convergence of economic interests and protection to labor and staff members. So I'd like to talk to Antônio Lisboa. How do you perceive this, and what is the participation of the labor class in this political scenario, given the challenges we face nowadays? And how can we secure that a recovery and new policies do not come at the expense and at the loss of laborers? And if you can just let us know a little bit what you think about this topic. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gents. I'd like to thank you all very much for inviting me, and it's a great source of pleasure to talk about such issues. I myself would like to start by thinking a little bit about the kind of world we live in nowadays. This is the kind of world that is being impacted by the global pandemics we're going through. But I usually say that when we organized our CUTE Congress, our National Congress a year ago, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about that. But if we go back in time a year and compare the world we had by October 2019 and October 2020, one will be able to see that a lot has changed, but not everything has changed. So we had a world that was on the rise when it comes to the growth of inequality, the growth of di- improper employments and other kinds of conditions. And the ILO letter that was approved last year, they say that on top of the 200 million unemployed people back in the day, it was important to come up with 300 million jobs by 2030 to meet the demands by new staff members that are coming in to the marketplace. So Last year, a year ago, basically, we had a lot of inequality and very fast changes brought about by the fourth industrial revolution. And when we bring that to November, early November 2020, under the pandemic scenario, what we see is that the pandemics has served two different purposes. First, to fast track these huge inequalities, and then secondly, to discontinue the source of profit we had back in the day. So the ILO had an event, and the head of the ILO said that 429 million work posts have been impacted by the pandemics. So if we consider that we were in the deficit by 200 million people unemployed, we need an additional 500 million, half a billion jobs to cover these people on top of the 300 million jobs by 2030 to welcome youth that is joining the marketplace. So these are unsurmountable challenges we have ahead of us. And when we think of Brazil, this kind of a process starts happening and starts gaining speed in 2017 with the approval of the labor law reform. This labor law reform has been approved based on basically two major speeches back in the day. The message was that it was going to generate jobs, and secondly, that it was supposed to strengthen uh, agreements between employers and staff. When it comes to jobs, we can see we have 13.3% unemployment in Brazil. So this was basically uh, an empty speech. And we, of course, we have to consider the pandemics. But even before the pandemics, it was confirmed that the labor reform did not generate jobs. When it comes to the strengthening of negotiations between employers and staff, it happened basically the opposite. What happened within the labor reform was an attack towards the unions. So how can you reinforce negotiations if you're trying to extinguish unions? I was talking to a colleague of mine in the throughout the, in fact, TUAC is the name of the institution. And how can reinforce negotiation between employers and staff members if you are attacking unions? And Brazil is basically a candidate for a seat in OECD. And so this is what's happening. And only people who don't want to see this will be able to ignore this. That's where Brazil's headed. As I said, this process of breaking down the labor relations in Brazil has been on the rise, and it gained more and more momentum since the labor reform in 2017. Basically, the two main messages were completely contradicted. So we didn't generate jobs, and we haven't strengthened negotiation between employers and staff members. Much to the contrary, it weakened this process. And with the pandemics that achieved, that reach all of us, we can see that this has fast tracked the whole process. And the biggest impact that the pandemics had in Brazil was basically for informal workers. So these are the ones that are the most pressure, and they are suffering the most with the pandemics. And regardless what is done nowadays with the emergency support, that we didn't, we knew that the government didn't want to approve that, but opposition caused it to be approved, and the social movements caused it to be approved as well. But it's these informal labor segments that took the blunt of the pandemic's attack. But they were, of course, under pressure with this labor reform. I usually say that, but I was in Washington 2 years ago. There was a technician from the World Bank in a panel, and during that panel, they covered experiences which strengthened the fight against informality are experiences that strengthen the formalization of labor. And he was very unhappy in presenting the Brazilian labor reform as a positive model for fighting informal labor. When I was going to do my contribution, I said, okay, you can use this legislation for fighting informal posts in the labor marketplace. But I'd like to tell you that 130 years ago, we had slavery that was official and formal in Brazil because it was provided for in law. So for us, it's not just a matter of making work formal if you're just bringing improper working conditions to the legislation. So improper working conditions are things that have to be fought. This is as important or even more important than fighting informal working posts, because you can only have dignified work if you have formal labor with preserved rights. And the Brazilian president said something that was very famous, that Brazilians have to choose between having rights or having a job, because one cannot have both. This is just a summary of what slavery is. If you're a slave, you have no rights. If you want to have rights, you cannot be a slave. What I want to say about this is, with the advancement of improper conditions of work that has come since the labor law reform, and with the pandemics on top of that, we are more and more distant from achieving the 2030 or the SDGs for 2030. I usually say that the 2030 agenda is closer to 1950 than 2030. And when we talk about SDG 8 and the third uh, SDG, which fights this kind of precarious conditions, we see that over the last 5 years, Brazil is growing apart from this kind of a target, which is basically sustainable development. So, what we need to do in order to answer your question is, what are the pathways we're looking for right now? Of course, we're going through a process which Carlos Lupi described quite well. We are in the process of organizing or needing to organize labor movements and secure rights for staff members. But our strategy has to undergo other kinds of union strategies. The Congress or conference we organized a year ago, we approved in our strategy and our minutes that CUT and unions have to start representing all staff members. We cannot represent just staff members who are formally employed, because if things continue like that, they're going to grow to shorter numbers. So our strategy nowadays is to move forward to represent the whole of the labor class, formal or informal workers. So we need to understand that the union has to reach these workers, regardless of what kind of work they do, so that we can help them organize themselves so they can fight for decent employment. Because if they don't get organized, they're not going to be able to achieve a position of decent employment. And we have done some initial investigations along the course of that initiative. The category that is the largest one in Brazil are the people who work under apps, like 4, 5, 6 million people working for apps. And we are in a process of investigating this kind of scenario in Brazilian Recife, so that we can, based on this research, we can reach these kind of workers. But of course, we're not talking about uh, app workers only. Any kind of association of laborers, like fishermen and seamstresses, are basically an object of study and an object of an organization process, so we are able to really strengthen the union movement to gain momentum and to secure dignified work conditions and salaries to everyone. And that's it. Well, thank you, Antônio. This was very interesting. And I'd like to mention one of the topics that you brought up. You said that the pandemic has fast-tracked the inequalities that already exist. And for women, we see that this is a reality. Women are being definitely impacted by the pandemics. And with that, we move over to Joana. Joana covers this kind of a topic under the point of view of the importance and relevance of social security mechanisms, particularly for women. So now we move over to Joana. Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be part of this panel and here with such distinguished colleagues. I was interested with talking about the gender issue, and I'm going to be the feminist witch of the day. So I'd like to talk to you about how important it is to take a step back and to bring gender to the main stage. Maybe I may mention one or two new things to some of you, and we are able to redress that reality. So, gender has basically been constituted by some social norms and rules. One of them is domesticity. This rule basically places people in boxes in specific positions for the production of remunerated production, the public works that are basically granted towards men, and reproduction and non-remunerated work and the private kind of work to women. So gender is unnatural. It's not about gender at birth. It's not sexuality or, being able to have sexual relations and whatever, hetero homosexuality. But it's not that. It's a social process for the production of individuals, segregating them and placing them in hierarchy with this following dichotomy: the female, which is fragile, unstable, emotional, and very particular, and masculine, which is strong, stable, rational, that speaks in a universal language. So the segregation of work, which is important in the gender area, is a material foundation of assignment of value to gender. So this is a process, a flexible kind of work that is molded over time and space, but it's very long lasting. Any changes and segregations in gender in the workplace have happened because of women's movements and changes in capitalism. But women are still responsible for labor in the home, and the state contributes very little for the sharing of that kind of a work.
The number of children who are in daycare in Brazil, for example. So the domesticity norm with this ideal of a pure 19th century woman with the colonial process, which we cannot disregard when we are a product of this. For example, producing Black women who could have been part in this work environment. Today, these are the washing women, the confectioners, the history of imprisonment due to loitering of Black workers in São Paulo and Rio on the street. And today, this is just updated. We have the fourth prison population in the world, and 62% of them are Black women. The norm of domesticity produces the masculine superiority over the Black women. Now, the Black men, they do not have the same patriarchal domain over their women not even over their domicile, because they do not have a stable income and it's not enough for their own sustain. We call this intersectionality. The intersectionality is especially relevant for Brazil and for Brazil's labor environment. But why are you saying anything related to histories, Joana? The problem is that we have to keep on repeating ourselves on this. And they're not interested. And they say that women in Brazil are just the same as men, but they are not. But we need to resume this conversation. The gender inequality, according to the World Economic Forum and the Global Agenda Gap, Brazil is the 19th most unequal country. So inequality is worsening since 2014. If we consider the last 12 years, we could only reach equality within 116 years. And we are not going to live to see this. The continuous activity shows that in Brazil, women work around 21 hours with unpaid jobs at their homes. And usually men only work 10 hours, whether they're occupied or not, they say it's 10 hours. The women have an average of 5 hours of unpaid jobs, and this varies according to social levels. People who own a minimum salary, they have twice as much the work of unpaid work in comparison to women who earn around 8 minimum wages. What is clear and what we see is that we have 33% of children with access to daycare, and high-income women, children, they have 53% of access to daycare. And the lowest number of people, which are the ones with the lowest income, 23%, they have access to daycare. The budget for daycare in Brazil is just zero today, zero. And what is being replaced? This budget system, budget distribution, is something that includes visits, so that the women who already take care of their children can take better care and spend more time with their children. And I don't see how they can spend more time than they already do. 85% of people with disabilities are taken care by women from poor families. And of course, this is bringing impact and in the workforce. Of course, they have a lower participant rate. When women have more than 70%, the average salary is 30% lower. This tax is 15% for women and 12% for men. They have lower access to professions. We occupy more than 30% of management positions, formally and informally. We have occupational segmentation and segmentation of places that are dedicated to women or men, and this is always related to this domestic savoir-faire and emotional ability, which are considered normal abilities for women. So that would consider customer service, for example, telemarketing, supermarket cashiers, stores. Women are more present, and they can, who are in a better position, they can work at home, but they still within more informal means of work. And usually they have a very conflicting demission and termination cycle, different from men. How does this impact social protection? And how does this forms the subject? This is part of the recognition of situations of dependency. We are dependent during childhood, during when we are ill, when we are uh, living death, during poverty. These are dependence situations, and this risk is just continues, especially with with the social devices of that generate dependency and force the lack of protection, and they modulate the possibility of this homo economicus that makes decisions, that has agency over life. These are social devices that are based on the technology of risk, and as taught by Robert Castell, it is regarding the social property. The risk operates contention of uncertainty for the provision of conditions, of life conditions in face of dependency. It nominates the risks and it uses techniques to calculate uncertainty, to bring elements to mitigate such effects. The dispute on the distribution of independence versus autonomy is exactly one of the processes that produces gender, because the feminine is dependent and the masculine is autonomous, and so they say. And the men who have accessed the most formal jobs, they have more conditions for autonomy during their life cycle. So in a scheme, when the uncertainty happens, there's a possibility of a future event that is not desired. We look at this certainty and we calculate the risk, and with technically we constitute funds to deal with this risk. And when the dependency situation happens, we need to use the technology to provide care. But who is responsible for this process? The neoliberalism is changing this distribution, which is your social organization of the risk management and care. This is going to impact the gender relationship, and this reorganization, the procedures with social security and social assistance, that this transfer that impacts women, but also it reduces the load from those who are overcaring. It allows hiring of caretakers, assistive technologies, medicines. This helps those who help. So we are in such a part of a story that individuals are called to their responsibility, and the lack of responsibility of Nauster's state is what complements the way the subjects live their life cycle. The neoliberalism is not only a state management, it's a series of procedures, a series of considerations, people in their own places in their cycle. But how about the future of work? How is it within gender? First of all, I would like to say that the future of work is much closer to the past than we can imagine. In case of Brazil, historically, we have articulated the chain values to the most precarious ends and the least glamorous parts of global capitalism. This was the case of the industrial capitalism when we entered with slavery and the exploration in the models of plantations. The Fordian capitalism was sort of internalized in our own industrialization, but we continue generating value, exporting minerals, and the work was extremely precarious and still slaved by debts. In a flexible capitalism since 1970s, we've been uh, managed with outsourcing and taylorism. we still continue with the extinction and degradation of the environment. We have always been articulating with forms of production, but in a submitted position. A lot of economical volatility, and with Veronica Gago, an Argentinian, credible Argentinian, who said, and she's also a political scientist and anthropologist, a way to create an inhabitable world has been in part of what we call informality. And I want to change the way we look at informality, and I'd like to propose a more productive way of looking at it. This is not only a condition in the work environment. It's just a means of life. It's a possibility to create life through time. An extremely volatile economy and very violent when characterized within work in a binomial serve and be served. What sort of formal work are we talking about? Work that is strongly characterized by the mandatory and so a servant. And everything here is informal. The address, the work away from home, everything is informal. The mother that takes care of children for us to work. The things you borrow from your neighbors. So the best way to live in informality is the turning, which is to create inhabitability in an uncertain world. If there is an historical moment in which crisis management and uncertainty management is valuable, this is our historical moment. The turning is the future. These mobilized knowledge at small scales cannot be reproduced in a large scale. They are connected with the exchange, with help, with community networks and family, and among immigrants. We have a large Bolivian population of immigrants now, and they are all in coordination with the contingency, with the chain value that are capitalist. In this bricolage, the capitalism captures the values that are produced in a very small scale. So, reaching my end of my presentation, the capitalism, uh, the home office for this can be produced in a small scale in small networks without having to assimilate the integration and creation of common values and the identity of a company or union identity. Even the variation of the quality of the products are already externalized by the consumers. Those are the ones who evaluate the likes, the grading, the scoring, the telemarketing queues. So the values of workers' qualification, progression to risk, the purchase of equipment, amongst other, are all exteriorized to the workers, their families, and all the networks that are mobilized by them. Well, negotiation with the company is also over the shoulders of workers. So the intermediation of technologies and third-party technologies and chains, they produce what we call an odd look. There is a lack of identification that are implied in the work in the future. The exchange with clients, it's going to be empty. We are never with the same Uber driver or never with the same manicure from the app. The interaction with the employers are minimum. The exchange with co-workers are minimal. We don't have a fixed place to work. So what I'd like to call the attention to is the idea of considering other forces that create this subject, and not the subject of work as we work, but this subject that causes the turning. There is a tendency of substitution of experience with work by familial networks for the creation of identity. Just to finish, the turning is the future of work, and Brazilian women are specialists in turning. The capitalism is based on small-scale actions, but this composition with the capitalism are contingent, and they are problematic, especially by the capital itself. The odd way of action brings competitiveness, and these all encompass the other aspects such as religious morality, for example. What are the women going to be like in this configuration? I think these are important disputes towards the future of work, whether they are paid or unpaid, and disputes around the future as a possibility, considering the future is not guaranteed. Thank you. Thank you very much, Joana. Very important contributions regarding what informality is and dependency situations. Considering
Give us an input from your work at the Future of Work Initiative. We would be glad to get to know more your perception of on the impact of platform economies and artificial intelligence on labor markets. And also the OECD has conducted some interesting analysis on the impact of the COVID crisis on low-skilled workers, young people, women. So if you could share some of your thoughts with us, be very, very happy.
Sure. And first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a very impressive panel, a very interesting conversation so far. I am sorry to be speaking in English. I actually used to speak Portuguese, but it's too long ago, and I would be embarrassed to speak now in Portuguese. So I will continue in English, and I also want to thank the translators who have been doing an excellent job so far. I think we have heard already that Brazil is a country with very high inequality. It remains extremely high. And we have also heard that we have lots of new challenges as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. COVID-19 has without a doubt worsened inequality, and I don't think Brazil is an exception to that trend. COVID-19 has hit the low-skilled, the low-paid in particular, and also other groups like women, like we've just heard. We know in many countries women have left the labor force because they're taking care of children because schools are closed. So there are many, the groups that already did worse in the labor market are doing even worse now. And I think this is a very worrying trend. I want to have a brief digression on social mobility. Some people might argue that inequality might not matter so much if you have a lot of social mobility. So what do we mean by this? We mean that people who are at the bottom of the income distribution can move upwards. If that is the case, maybe inequality matters less to some extent. But in OECD countries, we know that what we call this social elevator is broken. On average, in OECD countries, if you are in the bottom of the income distribution, it will take 5 generations for your children to reach the middle of the income distribution. In Brazil, it takes 9 generations. Again, it shows you that this elevator, the social elevator, is broken. Now, I'm here to talk about the future of work. We've heard a lot of negative things so far. We also see a lot of opportunities in the future of work. Before COVID-19 happened, in most countries, we were seeing rising employment rates. We were seeing lots of opportunities as a result of technological change. But there are also risks. I think the risks can be managed. but the risks tend to be bigger for people who are already vulnerable. So the risks of automation, for example, tend to be higher for people who are low skilled. The risks of precarious work, for example, in the platform economy, are greatest for people who are low skilled. And if we don't have the right policies in place, these risks will materialize. Without the right social protection, without investments in skills, without social dialogue, we will have a society that will not be able to grab the opportunities that exist in the future of work, and rather the risks will materialize. So there are opportunities, but it's very difficult to grab these opportunities if you have a very big divide. And one divide is the digital divide. We need to invest more in skills, in digital skills, but also in access to digital tools. For example, in Brazil, we know that 25% of Brazilian adults have never used the internet. That's 1 in 4 Brazilian adults have not used the internet. And there are very strong inequalities in internet use depending upon education, depending upon income, age, but also regional divisions. It's really important, I think, also to continue investing in skills more generally. Usually what we see is that the future of work does bring more jobs. It brings more high-skilled jobs. So in order to grab these opportunities, you need to invest in skills. But we also know that in Brazil, inequalities are very strongly linked to inequalities in the educational system. Only 2% of students in Brazil perform at the highest level of the PISA scores in at least one subject. 2%. In the OECD, on average, that's 16%. In Brazil, 43% of students on the PISA tests score below the minimum level of proficiency. 43%. And that's in all 3 subjects, compared to 13% in the OECD on average. And what we also see in Brazil is that socioeconomic status has a much stronger impact on your test scores than in other countries. So in education, we need to shift resources from tertiary education to secondary, primary, or even pre-primary. We heard Joana talk about daycare. Daycare is not just important for women and the labor market, it's also important to help children from lower socioeconomic backgrounds perform better at school and do better later on in the labor market. I think Brazil also needs to improve redistribution. For instance, when we look at the allocation of social spending, a lot of it goes to middle-class households. So 15% of GDP goes to social spending in Brazil, but only 0.5% of GDP goes to Bolsa Familia, which is a highly effective scheme to help poor households. And I want to keep my intervention relatively brief, but I think another point which we have made at a number of during this exchange today is the importance of social dialogue. I think solutions to the problems that we face have to be found jointly. They have to involve all the social partners, the stakeholders, because there is nothing inevitable about the future. The future is a vision that we build together. It's one that we choose. I think also this is where we talked about unionization. We talked about bargaining power. With many new forms of work, but also more traditional forms of work, we know that there are pockets of the labor market where workers have very poor bargaining power, where workers have very few outside options. They cannot go to their employer and say, if you don't give me these conditions, I will find a job somewhere else. They don't have that option. So the employer can impose working conditions, can impose wages, which are lower than what you would see in a competitive market. Even employment might be lower. This is what we call a situation of monopsony, where employers abuse their bargaining power. I am not saying this happens everywhere in the labor market, but it is a significant issue. We need to address this monopsony. We need to address the imbalance in bargaining power. And of course, one way of doing this is by strengthening the bargaining power of workers where they don't have that. Just to give you one example here that's very important, we talked about platform workers. In most countries, platform workers are self-employed workers. Because they are self-employed, in most countries, they're not allowed to bargain collectively. Because they are self-employed and supposedly businesses. And yet these are often workers with a very poor bargaining position in the labor market. And so they cannot bargain collectively, and they tend to have very precarious working situations with very low incomes and very little security in their job. And at the same time, they don't have social protection, they don't have employment protection. And so these are vulnerable workers that really need stronger protections in the labor market. So I want to end my presentation by just briefly saying that I think the future offers opportunities, but we start from a very bad point, and we have new challenges with COVID-19. It's really important to have the right policies in place to help workers grab the opportunities that exist, and especially workers who are already in a vulnerable position and who are likely to suffer more of the risks that lie ahead of us. So I thank you very much for your attention. Again, I'm sorry to be speaking in English, but I look forward to the questions at the end of the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stijn. Such an interesting contribution on the impact of inequalities on low-skilled workers and the need for stronger protection in labor markets, everything. It's a very insightful contribution. Vou passar.
Now we're going to move on to the questions. So we don't have too much time left, but we can get back to whatever points we have heard from our colleagues. So the first question is coming in to Antônio. How can we avoid the degradation of working conditions because of the Uberization effect? What are the possible regulation scenarios in there? Do you have a take on this? Well, I believe that the global unionized movement that has been approved in the International Union Conference that was conducted in 2018 is based on a strategy aimed towards the construction of a new agreement, a new social agreement. And this, of course, covers the protection of all the rights to all workers that are in the society. And when it comes to this platform-based economy, this is a bit of what I said. So within national parliaments, we have to be able to raise the pressure on policymakers to make sure that these workers have a series of rights regulating their work as well. So we need to regulate the process for all of these workers. And secondly, a bit of what I said in my first participation goes along the line of having these workers as part of an organization and unions of sorts, because we can only move forward when it comes to securing rights and dignified working conditions if we unionize them. So we have to work along two main pathways. So we have to organize these workers. I'm not saying that I'm going to do that, but they have to get organized, and we have to develop and maintain dialogues with them and raise their capacity for organization. And based on that level of organization and their awareness of the kind of work they do and the rights they have, this survey we're doing in Brazil and Recife comes along this line of, breaking the paradigm that these workers consider that, because they don't consider themselves as workers. And it's not like that. Sometimes they don't perceive in themselves a formal worker, a traditional worker, so to speak. But data we already have nowadays uh, says that many of them are against the labor legislation, but they want to have the rights that are secured to other workers. So we have to try and unionize and organize them so they have a voice within the national parliament in Brazil's case, and to organize them internally so that they are able, as workers, become aware of who they are and fight for their rights. So there isn't much of a mystery in there. It's nothing new in the front when it comes to the process. If they want to move forward when it comes to securing their rights, they have to perceive themselves as workers and organize themselves and unionize themselves to have the power to fight within all levels of government, national parliament, uh, all kinds of bodies that represent the government, even the city hall. So I wrap this up by saying that their rights and their needs are basically manifested through legislation or by having the government meet these workers' needs. Many of them voice their needs, for example, saying, well, we had a meeting with them a while ago last year, and we asked them what their main uh, requirement was back in the day. And they said, well, we wanted a place to rest and to be able to recharge our smartphones. So that process goes through the powers that be, whatever levels of power we're talking about, we have to get them to get organized to grant them legal working rights they have and they are entitled to. Thank you very much, Antonio. This was a very interesting take. Now I have one more question regarding informal work. I think this is to you, Joana. Joana, can you hear us now? Well, apparently not. So let's move ahead. Mr. Lupi, we have a question for you. We have some challenges that are unexpected in the Brazilian market, at least different from the ones that you were in power that you got to know when you were in power. So how can labor associations help workers like that? Well, we had a government in place that was in favor of workers, that helped their unions and their organizations. And today we live a new reality, and this reality is something that uh, we have, different behaviors nowadays with platforms like Uber, for example. This is an outsourcing of work, and when you outsource work, you pay a fee that goes from 10 to 12 or 15% for those who create that system, and then the government has to secure rest hours, regulation of the work, and this is to be done with a lot of clarity. The same way we had people that exploited the taxi system, like people had like 40 or 50 licenses, and they explored people for working on those licenses they had. And this is a repetition of that scenario. So the reality of the modern society is people exploiting other people. So this is going to continue, but till when? So nothing is more important than preparing workers. And I agree with you, Joan. It starts at the daycare, at elementary school, because some people in the mid class can pay for private classes, and it's a different reality. They have a better educational condition than public schools. If we don't have a good education at public school, even women are going to be discriminated against. And, women have to work, they have to leave their kids back in a daycare that has some kind of support for them. And sometimes kids go to daycare and they do nothing all day, but this is the reality. This is what happens in life. And we have to think deeply in education. I have a very dear friend of mine, Dusty Ribeiro, saying that, the education uh, frees people. It's a liberation. I love that sentence. We have to imagine that nowadays the main problem is the lack of commitment by a government that doesn't care about the weakest link, the workers in the market. So this is my view. How can we face and fight this? We have to get organized. We cannot be afraid of facing the scenario. We don't want people to fight, physically fight. We want to raise awareness amongst employers and staff members. Every time a labor right gets dropped, and people are afraid that they stay quiet because it seems like there was a campaign. I say that, uh, the right wing left the closet, so to speak, and they did that in a devastating way. So if we don't work with raising awareness and education and everything to face that, we're going to have tough times ahead of us. And this is something that is basically the result of the government. They don't care about the workers.
Thank you very much, President Lupi. Your perspective is very interesting. Now a question to you, Joana, regarding the turning and the informal work. We have one question. What are the challenges to increase the social protection at work, considering the high rates of informal work in Brazil? If you could say something about this, what are the possible ways out to it? Incredibly, informality is what frames the informality, the actual formality in Brazil. The high productivity of the formal sector has everything to do with the informality. There is a porosity between formal and informal. The person is not always informal or always formal. There is a come and go in there. For us to manage to make the formal a more extensive and intensive of way of working, and considering this a protection, I think we need to create a network of minimum universal protection in Brazil so that we can pressure formal to be more active. The problem is that our formal way of work is degrading. We don't say much about this, but the way our formal way of working is badly paid. It has a master servant sort of relationship. Have you realized how what the do you know what the most important, the most relevant disease they have in cashiers? They have bladder infection because they can't just go to the toilet whenever they want. So they sit there and work to the point of exhaustion. They have to manage their own work environment. They have to go to the supermarket for themselves. They have to take care of their children. There's no such thing as Saturdays and Sundays or holidays. What I mean by this is that if we don't protect them in a more universal way, they will have to work for anything and under any situation, whether formal or informal. And what I defend here is a basic universal income for Brazil with quality. Changing Bolsa Familia and treat it right to make this a discretionary policy. And when it's discretionary, it's not a right. Change this into a benefit adjustment that is above poverty line, something that adjusts the poverty line because this has been depreciated, and this is goes with the flow with what the government does. So we need to carry out an effective study of how much would be considered the poverty line or not, and how much would that income have to be, considering the access to income and it's not even, the benefit is not even a salary. It's about 190 reais per family. You can't even pay for the basic, very minimum food for your home. If you don't have a basic income, you just refrain this person from having a bond with any labor relationship. If we don't provide this minimum, we will not make the companies give that part of their minimum. The the minimum base salary is considered a reserve. People should not live under that minimum. It's not even ethical. It's not even good. I don't have to be here defending that minimum wages, but the person has to have the autonomy to be an entrepreneur, to take risks, and to be able to leave abusive relationships, for example. So today, this is what I defend. Thank you, Joana. Very interesting.
Now, Stijn, if you could quickly give like 1 minute or 2 minutes on this point of the informality and the tools that, if you have some thoughts about that with OECD, about considering your studies in the employment outlook, if you could close with this topic.
About how to address informality.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
the OECD published the job strategy. They published a revision of the job strategy not long ago in 2019. And in the job strategy, we lay out policies for improving labor market performance. So whether it is the number of jobs, the quality of jobs, or the inclusiveness in the labor market. And so one of the things that the job strategy talks about is how to address informality in the labor market. And there is a 4-pillar strategy in effect to address informality. One of the issues may be the cost of hiring. There's various things that affect the cost of hiring. It's a very difficult issue. For example, if you look at Brazil, the minimum wage, it's not very high in absolute terms, but when you compare it to the average wage in Brazil, it's more than 71%, I think, of the average wage, whereas in the average OECD country, it would be 50%. The other thing in Brazil is that non-wage costs are very high. So the kind of social security contributions, the income taxes, etc., are very high compared to other Latin American and Caribbean countries. So if the cost of hiring workers is too high, employers will try and avoid formality. The other thing is that, of course, if you're paying taxes and social security contributions, workers and employers need to see a close link to what they're getting in return for that. So working on that link, showing people what they get in return is very important. It may just be a matter of communication. The third thing is, of course, then enforcing the regulations around formality. That if you have a good labor inspector, and invest resources in a good labor inspector so that you can find cases of abuse, that is very important. But finally, also, and this is something I've already spoken about, is skills. There is a very strong link between education and formality. And so the more you're going to invest in skills and ensure that everybody has the skills required in the labor market, the less informality you're going to have. So this is the kind of 4-pillar approach that the OECD has been advocating for.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you very much. Muito obrigada.
Thank you very much. I apologize, but we have to close. It's the beginning of a discussion that can bring further discussions in the future for the rest of the conference. We still have 11 more panels, and the next one is going to be on Saturday regarding the environment. We have brought very diverse points of view and a lot of elements that can be further discussed at Cienspo and within the public that is following us. So I thank you very much for your participation. And let's keep in touch to develop this debate and to face these challenges that we see in Brazil today. Thank you very much and see you then.